Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-dit, da-da-da-da. At your service to describe a common method of discharging a random wire antenna. And by random wire we mean a long wire but not necessarily straight. A way of discharging this or keeping it from developing an electrostatic charge buildup, particularly in the vicinity of thunder showers. A long wire that you would use, the longer the wire, the more metal there is, the more electrostatic charge will build up under a given set of circumstances, and near a thunder shower that can be a considerable electrostatic charge, enough to spark all the way from the random wire, this green thing here, to the chassis of your tuner. If you have, for example, a feed-through insulator for your unbalanced antenna connection, it can literally arc right over that, and it can also arc inside the capacitors in the tuner, and if it's a small tuner, that's the end of those capacitors. So this is, and it also imperils you personally as you operate your radio. Not that you do it near a thunder shower, but sometimes they creep up on you. One way to do it that has been suggested is an inductor, a large value inductor connected between the wire and ground, in this case just right to the tuner chassis. This large value inductor will provide a DC ground while not letting RF through, assuming that the inductance is large enough. But what must that inductance be? As you go through your ham radio bands, you're going to encounter different impedances at this feed point. But the worst possible scenario is if it happens to be a half a wavelength long at 160 meters or 1.8 megahertz, or any multiple thereof, but the worst one is a half a wavelength. That is approximately 260 feet. Well, suppose in a case like that, this impedance here, this feed point impedance, will be a pure resistance equal to on the order of 4,000 ohms or so, maybe 4,500 ohms. Well, let's just, for the sake of simplicity in numbers, call it 4,000 ohms. That's a lot of feed point impedance. Well, as a general rule, the inductive reactance of this coil will have to be at least 10 times that. So let's calculate what the value of L would be at 1.8 megahertz. And I went ahead and did that using the familiar formula, inductive reactance in microhenries equals 2 pi times the frequency in megahertz times the inductance in microhenries. And what I ended up getting kind of surprised me. I ended up getting 354 microhenries to produce an inductive reactance of 4,000 ohms at 1.8 megahertz. Well, that's all very nice. But now remember, you have to, in this case, we are using megahertz here, microhenries here, so they tend to kind of cancel out. We don't have to resort to hertz and henries in order to get this in ohms. We can use megahertz and microhenries. We could also use kilohertz and millihenries, but I went for this formula and manipulated it around with the numbers and came up with this value for the inductor. If it were to have that, I keep saying characteristic impedance when I mean all sorts of other things like inductive reactance in this case. Well, if you want to have 10 times the inductive reactance, or XL equals 40,000 ohms, you're going to need an inductance of 3,540 microhenries. Which you might rather think of as 3.54 millihenries. Well, now that's a pretty big amount of inductance, and to do that for radio transmission at any significant power level, you can imagine the size of the coil you're going to get. If you want to try to do it with an air core, you're going to get a coil that's going to take up a whole room. If you want to run, say, 1500 watts, the maximum legal limit. At QRP, you might get away with those little old toroid coils or pot cores. You might be able to get away with something like that to get an inductive reactance like that. But it's got to be at least that big, and this is the worst case scenario, so that's what we probably should go with when we decide on what value we want for this coil. Depends on the bands that we want to operate on, but assuming we want to operate the whole radio spectrum available on most transceivers, 1.8 megahertz at the bottom to 29.7 megahertz at the top, we're going to want to have a coil with that value, 3.54 millihenries. Well, that's a tall order. And secondly, this coil right here is at the station, so that if the electrostatic charge buildup occurs, or if lightning strikes near your antenna, the current's going to come towards you and go through that coil, you hope, to ground. And this will have to be a good electrical ground in order for it to really work well. And so, and if you do that, say if you decide to use the third prong in the plugs in your house as your good electrical ground, which is what most people will do, you're kind of subjecting yourself to a bit of a risk. If possible, you should ground the far end of the antenna, which I've described in another video, but that's not always possible. Another way to handle a situation like this is to disconnect and ground the entire antenna when you're not using it. And that's what I would recommend doing for random wire discharge if you want to avoid having the inconvenience of providing a good electrical and RF ground at this end. It may not even be possible. It depends upon your QTH and your circumstances and everything else. But that is the most commonly imagined way of doing this, but it's not the best way in my humble opinion as a ham radio operator with a few years' experience. Enough to have seen some antennas that sparked all around when thunder showers were in the vicinity. And it was spooky, let me tell you. But in retrospect, I was a young kid when that happened, and it took a lot to spook me. Still takes a lot to spook me. Like the fact that maybe I might leave comments open by mistake. Stan Gibilisco signing off, saying 73 for now, which means best regards in ham radio jargon. And so long, which translates in my language to da-da-da-da-da-da.